missed everybody last week. And thank you to Tim for taking the class and walking through the letter. We were talking just a minute ago about how the break between chapter 1 and chapter 2 is not good. And it's helpful. One of the things I used to do, actually, when I was studying through a book, is I would go to the computer, which you can do on just about any website in the world, and you can take the text and you can copy it into a document. And if you have Bible software like Logos or eSword, there is a version of Logos, L-O-G-O-S, from the Greek word for word, or eSword, which is free, and you can download different Bible translations and you can copy the text into a Word document with no verse numbers and no chapter numbers. So when I studied the Gospel of John, I would take the text of John and I would copy it into a Word document and print it. And it is amazing the connections that you will see in the text when you stop reading it like it's a Western novel. Because when you see a chapter, right, if you're like me, you were taught that, well, we have chapters. And so we read through chapter 1, and when we get to the end of chapter 1, we stop. And in fact, again, if you're like me, when you have a reading plan, you probably do your reading plan based on chapters. Oh, I just have to do one more chapter today, and then I'm done. Well, the biblical text doesn't work that way. Here's a perfect example. And so when you get to the end of chapter 1, this is not a good spot to stop. The thought continues on, and you can see that with the very first word is so. That's very much like therefore, or because these things are true. Everything that we've just talked about is flowing into this. And so what we'll do is we'll just back up a little bit in verse 22 and kind of take a running start into the beginning of chapter 2. And so he starts off by saying, having your souls purified by obedience to the truth for a sincere brotherly love, love one another earnestly from a pure heart, since you have been born again, not of perishable seed, but of imperishable, through the living and abiding word of God. And then he's going to quote something for us. So the first thing we need to look at is this idea of being purified. Why is that significant? What is important about being pure or purified? Yes?
Well, you talk earlier about being holy as God is holy. When you go back to the Old Testament, you read about that part of the process of becoming holy, purifying yourself, clean, clean.
Yeah. The idea of cleanliness, right? We hear that and we think, wash your hands before supper, which is not a bad thing to do. But you go back to the temple, and the idea of cleanliness is being made appropriate for appearance before God. There is a complete sanctification of the whole person, inward and outward. We tend to think of ourselves as divided parts. We tend to think that we're different pieces. And there are things in the text that almost make it sound like that, not necessarily Peter, but more Paul's writing, that make it sound like you have different parts that are independent of one another. And I do think it is true that there are different pieces that make up a human, but at the same time, those are all one thing, right? The idea of being spiritually pure also includes physical purity. And so when God has the people coming before him, he reconciles them to himself spiritually, and he has them cleansed physically. And so that it's the whole person that is made good. And here you have this sort of same thing, this idea of a pure person. The word soul is used in the Old Testament text. When God breathed into Adam, he made him a living soul, is the word. And so that word moves over here into the New Testament, having purified your soul by obedience to the truth. Now this is the whole person. Everything about you is now purified, made clean so that you can go into God's presence. Now, this idea of being obedient to the truth, we have to be careful how we understand that. If we make it our obedience that purifies us, what happens the very first time you make a mistake in any way whatsoever? Yeah, you would no longer be pure, right? And if you ever struggle with the idea of not being good enough or strong enough or holy enough or faithful enough or any of those things that we tend to doubt, we're probably focusing too much on ourselves and not enough on God. God really is the one who purifies our souls. Right? I can't do that. When the Israelites came before God in the temple, it was God who declared them clean. Now, he had things for them to do, but it was God who declared them clean. They really weren't cleansing themselves, right? It is God who declares them clean. Now, this idea of obedience means that there are things that we have to do, right? It's a two-way street, but it's not an even number of lanes, right? God has like a 1,000-lane highway, and we have a little dirt path that we walk on. So God is doing the heavy lifting, but there are obligations that we have too. We obey the truth. And this idea of obedience is not necessarily, right, indicative of these 13 commandments that you have to do in order to be right with God, but it is bringing, just like we're purifying the whole person, it is bringing the whole person into alignment with what is true. And so it is a fundamental changing of direction. Right? We were headed away from God. We were living in the darkness. Now the whole person is being brought in alignment with who God is and what God would have us to be. And what is the result of that? By changing who we are, what are we going to see now in ourselves? Love. Yeah, love for each other. This is brotherly love. And love one another earnestly from this now pure heart that you have. And we can do all this because we've been born again. Right? And we'll see this later in the letter about this idea of biting and devouring and fighting and doing all those things. James will sort of highlight that. You do all these things because you're focused on yourself. And so now we have been purified, and because we have been born again, not of perishable seed, but of imperishable, through the living and abiding word of God. So we have been made alive again. We have been born again through what God has done for us. So what is significant about it saying not of perishable but imperishable? What is the perishable origin of your existence? Yeah, your physical form. And who'd you get that from? Well, I mean, like, not ultimately, but immediately. Mom and dad. Yep. We're British today. Got to say mom. Yeah, your parents. Right? That's where you came from. If you're made in the image of your parents, you are going to die. That's just sort of the nature of things. But now you go to the ultimate picture that Dan mentioned. You go all the way back to the beginning, when God made the man and the woman in the garden. How long does it seem like he intended for them to be alive? Forever. Why would we say that? Why do we think that God intended for them to dwell with him forever? The tree of life is there in the garden. And if they take from the tree of life, they will live. Why would he put it there if he didn't want them to live? Right? He gave it to them as a gift. And there's also, you can approach it from the other direction. He warns them that they will die when they sin. God created them sinless. He put them in a garden where it's possible for them to dwell with him and to be in his presence, in his glory for all eternity. And death doesn't enter in until they sin. So that's sort of like God making it possible for them to live with him forever. That's God's intention. It doesn't happen, not because God isn't strong enough, but because God allows humans to choose. And when they choose, human history is the result. But now we're escaping that corruption, and we're moving to incorruption. We're escaping the perishable and moving to the imperishable. And the way that that happens is through the living and the abiding word of God. Certain religious authorities throughout time have variously, and at different times, declared the Bible to be a dead letter. What is a dead letter? When you hear that, what does that mean to you? Like a dead language.
It's not really usable.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not usable. In fact, the reason why Latin has sort of been adopted as the language of science is not only because just traditionally it was, but people don't use it anymore. So the language doesn't change. It's not alive. It's not moving. Right? English is constantly changing. We keep making new dictionaries because the way that humans who speak English use our words, it changes. And so we're having to constantly update. What does this word mean now? How do people use this word? Well, that's sort of the picture you get here, not that the Word of God changes, but that it is moving, right? It's doing stuff. It's alive. and it is abiding. So how long will it be alive? Forever. Yeah, forever. And so this word is living, it is abiding, and the cool thing about the text is there are a variety of options that Peter could have used here for the word. He could have chosen a word that means message. Rhema is sort of the message. He could have chosen a word that means like words, gramma or graphe. He could have chosen those things. But he chooses the word logos. So he's got all these options where he can refer to things that would be limited, right? It would focus your thoughts onto text. But he chooses a word that will not only include, right, the text, but it will also include a person. Why would logos be a significant choice here? Who is the logos of God?
Jesus is John 1.
Yes.
The Greeks also viewed this word wasn't just a word like you're saying. It was kind of the beginning point. It was the basis on which other things were.
Yeah, it's the origin. We can think of it like that. It's the origin, the big idea. It's more than just like a chunk of text. It's like the source. And so that's absolutely the idea here. And I think that early believers had all of that wrapped into this meaning. When they would refer to the logos of God, John 1, here you go. The Word is with God. It is God. The Word becomes flesh. And the Word, while he is flesh with us, speaks the word. Right? I mean, he's constantly going back and referencing it. And I think it is a mistake, in a sense, to try and separate these things out, because the embodiment of Scripture is Jesus. He is the one who came to fulfill all things. Yes?
Something else about that strikes me is you can't separate Jesus from the Word of God, where they're perfectly intertwined, if you will. They fit together. They're perfect harmony. The problem with hypocrite is he says one thing and he's completely another thing. God's entirely consistent with what he says.
Yeah. Yes. It is out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. And so here we have God speaking to us out of his heart. He's telling us who we are. I don't know if we have any theater buffs here, but in a play, the most important thing is what a character says about themselves. Or if you want to know who a character is in a play, it's just sort of the conventions of plays. Characters will do things. Other characters will speak about whoever you're focusing on. And then that person, that player, will also speak about themselves. In a play, when an actor or a character speaks about themselves, that is the most revealing in the play, right? About who they are. Just sort of by convention. And go ahead.
The net says enduring word. It doesn't change.
Yeah.
Like Hebrews 13 says, Jesus, yes, the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. The word is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow.
Yes. Yes, because God doesn't change. And this word, if we want to think of God speaking to us, he's breathing these things out, he is telling you who he is. And so when you think about just sort of the conventions that we develop in writing, if what I tell you is the most important thing, and really we understand that in speech too, you can't know what I'm thinking unless I tell you. Here is God telling us who he is, speaking out of the abundance of his heart, showing himself to us, both in what is written, and finally, ultimately, most beautifully, in his Son. Here are the things, all of these things are coming to us, and now we can be born again. We can no longer be corrupted, we can no longer be perishing, but we can be incorruptible and imperishable because we have been born, in a sense, through God. Right? Through who God is, through what God has said, through all the things that God has done. And it's just this beautiful image of that's where we're coming from. And then you get this contrast of us being like grass and how the glory fades away. So one of my favorite things about Texas is the wildflowers. Tennessee has trees and bushes that flower, and they're absolutely beautiful. And they last a lot longer than the wildflowers did in Texas. When you drive down a Texas highway, where we lived, at least in Texas, there weren't very many trees because you would have long stretches of time where there's no rain. So there's not all these beautiful bushes and these ornamental trees. You have just different types of plants. But the wildflowers are amazing. It's like driving down the highway and there are rainbows of color all up and down the highway. In fact, the State Department in Texas actually has a little subgroup that goes and plants wildflower seeds. That's what they do. So your tax dollars hard at work, planting wildflower seeds up and down the highways. But for about 3 days, it's really beautiful. And so it rains and rains and rains, and then it stops and doesn't rain anymore, and all the plants bloom, and here they are. They're just absolutely gorgeous. And then the sun comes out and kills them all. That vision really speaks to me here. This is what we are, right? You're planted, you bloom, and you're this incredible thing. You're in your early 20s, and you're strong, and you can do just about anything. It's the reason why you think you're indestructible and bulletproof, but not for long. Sometimes that frailty is revealed even earlier. Yes, Dan.
Yeah, I think this is very hard-hitting,
Like Moses says, teach us to number our days, that we may have wisdom. That is, teaching history is one of my favorite things to teach my kids, because history is cruel. She is cruel. Who's Vercingetorix? Does anybody know? Vercingetorix. It's the most important Gaulish king. And he is the one that the Romans were the most afraid of. Did you know? Does anybody know? Okay, I thought. The reason why I like to bring him up is he is the reason that Julius Caesar becomes famous. Julius Caesar would not have been Julius Caesar without him. He is the one who's uniting all of the Gaulish clans together. He was actually going to push Rome back into Rome. And the course of history would have been different because of this Gaulish king. But Julius Caesar comes and they fight, and now nobody remembers him, but everybody remembers Julius Caesar. History is very, very cruel. And in the history of France, he is one of the most important people, the other probably being Charles Martel. Does anybody remember that one? Charles the Hammer. How would you like to have a nickname? Your nickname, the Hammer. He stopped, well, I guess his soldiers did, the Muslim invasion into Europe. In fact, if he hadn't stopped them, the invading armies of the Muslims would have swept through Spain, swept through Gaul, all the way over, and they would have scissored, right, Europe. And again, the history of the world would be very different, and we would probably be speaking Arabic or some derivation thereof, and not English. Charles Martel, but nobody remembers him. You may have heard of his grandson, Charlemagne. But that, I mean, how cruel is history that you have these people who alter the way that our future, our lives are, and we don't even remember their names. Right? So to Dan's point, that's exactly what you're being told, is we think, right? We think that we're really, really big, but we're not. We're beautiful for a minute because God made us. And so we do have this divine beauty that shines forth in what we are, in our ability to create, but that's quickly sapped and taken away. We can see weakness in the world around us, and just like the grass withers and the flower falls, we will pass away. But the word of the Lord remains forever. And this word is the good news that was preached to you. So there is something that endures, there is something that lasts, but it isn't us. It's God.
It isn't us, but the flip side of it is, it's because of the choice we made it is for us. And it goes back to the inheritance and everything else, that it is absolutely what's going to be when it's all said and done, because of the choice you made to be a child of God, the obedience to the truth.
Yes. And that gets us then to chapter 2, what we call chapter 2, right? So because these things are true, put away, right? So Peter and Paul say a lot of the same things. Paul talks about this new humanity, we're being made into a new humanity, and that's pretty much what Peter is telling you. The world around us is crazy. It's always crazy. It causes us to live in difficult situations. These people are exiled. Tim talked last week about the situation and the scenario with Rome sort of pressuring the Christians and the Jews using Rome to do so. Right? Similar things, maybe not right here in Middle Tennessee, but similar things are still happening in the world around us today, especially in places where Christianity is not, popularly accepted. And so what we'll find is that we have to very much resist being who we used to be, being just like everybody else. One of the things that I used to find myself telling my children wrongly is I would ask them to just be normal. If you've ever been with kids, right, sometimes they do just like weird things, and you're like, why can't you just be normal? And, I don't want them to be normal. I don't. Because normal is bad. Normal is malice and deceit and hypocrisy and envy and slander. That's normal. The problem with the world is that people are normal. We act the way that people do. One of the things that was very telling in an economics class in high school, one of my teachers told me, she said, if you just expect people to do the most selfish thing possible, most of the time you'll be right. Because that's what drives economics, is the idea that people are going to be selfish. They're going to do what is in their own best self-interest. They're going to try and increase their own wealth. They're going to try and increase their own possession. And so from an economic standpoint, if you just picture everybody doing the most selfish thing possible, most of the time you'll be right. That's pretty scary. That's what drives things. And that's what makes our world operate, is self-centeredness. And so really what Peter is telling you here is the same thing that Paul says, that you need to be a new person. Right? We've been born again. There's that new person language, by the word that endures forever. Since you have been born again, live your new life now. I'm sort of paraphrasing what Peter is saying here. Live your new life in Jesus. Don't be the person that you used to be, but like Paul will say, to crucify the old person and to put off those old clothes, to put on as God's elect these new things. Here Peter's using the same sort of language. Put away. Separate yourself from malice, deceit, hypocrisy, envy, slander. What is malice? Bad things. Yeah. bad thoughts, bad things, the intent to do harm. Yeah, it's the aggravated part of the aggravated assault. Yeah, bad stuff. Don't do those things. We don't read it, but there is, in the extra books that sort of come along with the Bible, that the early Christians read, not necessarily as scripture, but as sort of like a library of spiritual work. One of the books is Tobit, and in the book of Tobit it says, the things that you hate, do to no one ever. That's pretty good advice. I like the way Jesus phrases it better. You know, the things that you would have done to you, do that. And so you have a positive thing, what Jesus is saying, and you have the negative idea in Tobit, the things that you hate, do to no one, ever. You think, do you like to be lied to? Well, no. Then don't lie. Do you like it when people treat you, when they act in their own self-best interest to your detriment? Well, then don't do that to them. And so that's sort of the idea here. This idea of malice is acting with an anger, a hate towards others, taking vengeance, if we want to think of it that way. If somebody's wronged you, so you're going to wrong them back. Don't do that. What is deceit? Yeah. Yeah. Slander. Yeah, I think he says that. We'll get to slander in a minute. Intentionally doing that. Sometimes I might tell you something and I could be wrong. I'm wrong all the time. And when I'm wrong and somebody points it out, I usually appreciate it. Usually. Sometimes not right away, because we all have pride. And sometimes it takes you a minute to go, you know what? You're right. I was wrong. Being wrong is okay. Everybody makes mistakes. I might remember something differently than you, and we get together and we talk and we can sort out what actually happened. What's not okay is knowing the right thing and intentionally telling you the wrong thing. And sometimes we try to do this in shades. Like Abraham talking to Abimelech about Sarah. Oh yeah, she's my sister. Kinda true, but also kinda not, because you're willfully leaving out like the most important descriptor of who she is. And so there's this sense in which we like to tell half-truths. I don't remember who said it first, but somebody once said a half-truth is a whole lie. And it's sort of with the caveat, right, that you don't have to tell everybody everything all the time. But when you do speak, what you say should be true. Like one of my favorite things is if somebody breaks into your house and says, tell me where your kids are. You don't have to tell them. You don't have to. It's not required. But when we do speak to somebody, it should never be deceit. Like willfully misleading someone when you should be speaking truth. So hypocrisy. What is that? We talked a little bit about this already. What is hypocrisy? Yeah. What were you going to say? Yeah, pretending to be something you aren't. So it's related to deceit because you're putting forth like this persona. You're pretending to be something that you aren't. It just means actor. An actor. That's what the word, like the original context of the word is an actor. Somebody who's pretending to be something that they really aren't. And so when we think about Christianity, one of the most common like attacks on Christians is that they're hypocrites. Well, I don't believe that. Because I don't present myself as somebody who is perfect. I don't present myself as this angelic being who floated down from the heavens and now all human history is graced because I have arrived. No, you see, that's not me. That would be Jesus. And Christianity is not me claiming to be perfect. It is me claiming to be a disciple of Jesus with all of my faults and all of my flaws and all of my shortcomings. And maybe somewhere along the way we sort of lost that sense of what it means to be a disciple, where we're failing forward, right? We're moving toward God, and we feel like we have to put up this facade of perfection. I'm not perfect. I'm not. I make mistakes all the time. Sometimes I even make mistakes on purpose. See, we would call that like willfully sinning, right? But sometimes I just do things I shouldn't. Romans chapter 7. That's me. I relate with what Paul is going through there. I'm not perfect, but Jesus is. And we have to own that as believers. It's not okay, as in acceptable, that we do things that are bad. We shouldn't have. But the reality is that we do. And our salvation, our sanctification, our justification are all based upon the perfection of Jesus and me coming to him in faith and striving to be like him. Like we see here, we're putting these things away because Jesus was none of these things, and we now have been born from the imperishable word, so we're striving to become like Jesus. So no hypocrisy. Don't pretend to be something that we aren't. We are people who are saved by God's grace, and we are striving to be more like Jesus every day. We don't always do a good job, but we're striving. What is envy?
Wish what you have, I have.
Yeah.
I want what you got.
Yeah. I want what you've got. Or I want people to focus on me, right? Not you. I use with the kids. So like photobombing, right? Photobombing is sort of like the embodiment of envy. You're taking this picture, and I want to get in the way. Right? I want the picture to be about me, so I'm going to steal the show. I'll use that example with our kids. When we try to talk about these words that are hard to understand, we'll use, photobombing. And when I'm focusing on Deborah, and I'm taking a picture of her because she's doing this cute thing, and one of her siblings runs in, and the background goes, you're trying to make the photo about you. You are envious of the attention that this person was getting, and you really wish that it was yours instead. And here you go. Yes, yeah. Yeah, it's very close to the word jealousy. And when we think about it, really, in the grand scheme of things, the attention that we get here from people, while it's great, I love to have friends, I love to spend time with people, but in the grand scheme of things, it sort of goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Those things don't matter. It doesn't matter if you were lifted up and lauded and recognized and given great accolades, because in 1,000 years, nobody's going to remember who you are anyway. It just doesn't matter. And so instead of being envious, we should be people who seek to instead outdo one another in showing honor. So instead of seeking to get the honor, you should be giving the honor. You think about Jesus and all the people that he ran into that were given honor and accolades and high positions, and instead of saying, hey, this should all be mine, you should focus on me, he instead gave honor to them. He recognized their authority. He recognized their positions. And the instruction that we're given is to honor those who are in power. One of my favorite things in Romans chapter 12, Christian competition, is to outdo one another in showing honor. Instead of striving to be the one who is exalted, strive instead to exalt others. So Christians should have like a complementing competition, which is sort of self-defeating, because then you win for being the best. Anyway. So that's the idea. Outdo one another in showing honor. Don't be envious. Yes, discontentment is sort of what drives that. We want what other people have because we're not content, which is why godliness with contentment is great gain. Yeah. Slander. What is slander? I wish they'd also put libel in there, but apparently they didn't make that distinction. Yeah, to speak evil of someone. And especially, like, the connotation of slander is that what you're saying isn't right. If somebody robs a bank and you say, hey, this person robbed a bank, that's not really slander. Now, it can become slanderous if you're using a past thing to try and color some future event. like looking back and recalling somebody's sins in order to make them look bad now. Right? That would sort of be included in that. But going to somebody and dealing with sin that they have just committed, and we're going to work with this right now, that's not slander. Because slander is this idea of speaking ill of someone inappropriately or especially falsely. So that's really important. And it's really important when it comes to things like accusations. If you're going to call somebody a liar, you better be really sure that they lied. Like my kids misremember things all the time. And one of the first words out of their mouth is liar. So we have to take them and we have to sit them down. We have to explain to them what a lie is versus not remembering correctly. We have to talk about different perspectives and how different people see different things. They remember different things. And so the first thing that you should do, instead of yelling liar, is to pause, realize that you might be the one who's not remembering things correctly, and then to ask questions. Why do you see things that way? I remember them differently. How can we reconcile these things? And so this idea of slander, it's very, very important. I think one of the worst things perhaps to happen to human relationships recently is social media. There's no filter on that. And people just fly off the handle immediately into all of these things. And there's no real repercussion. Because I can say it to people whom I've never met. I can say it about people that I may never see again. And there's no real life repercussion. And so we're doing all these things for me, right? It can really hurt other people. But we have to be careful.
See that all these things have in common that they're meant to hurt others.
Yes.
Full of lacks and things that hurt others.
Yeah, that's a great way to sum it up. All of these things are designed to hurt other people or to inappropriately elevate the self. They're selfish at the heart. And so it seems to be what Peter is saying is that exact thing. Don't hurt people, but love them. Remember that you were lost, but God has redeemed you. You were dying, but now you have life in Jesus. And so instead of being who you were, like newborn infants, brand new people, long for the pure spiritual milk that you may by it grow up into salvation, if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good. That word spiritual is cool. Does anybody's translation say something else besides spiritual? Does anybody's translation say logical milk? Logical. I know it doesn't, but that's the word, logikun. It's the same word in Romans 12, where he says, this is your spiritual service. It's the same word. And what's always been interesting to me is that people want to translate that word in Romans like 1,000 different ways. There's all sorts of different meanings there. People will put logical, people will put reasonable, some translations will say spiritual. But when we come to Peter, nobody ever says reasonable milk. Sincere. The King James says that? Silly Elizabethans. Sincere milk. You could put that in Romans 12, and it's the same idea. It is that which springs forth from who you truly are as God's child. From this idea of having this relationship that isn't based on physical things, but on spiritual things. And that word, the reason why it gets translated, reasonable is not a bad translation. Neither is logical, if you understand what those things meant. Right? And the idea is that it is the essence of sort of who you are. And the idea of you being a Christian now, this new person, remade in the image of Jesus, the new worship that you are going to offer him is that which is from who you are now, not who you were. Yes?
Yeah, I think the contrast in verse 2, or verse 1 and 2 is every relationship that the Lord had, whether they were his enemy or not, he had the right relationship approach to them. And this is Peter yet again reminding us and them of who they are and how they need to think and what they need to really hold on to so they can have
I think you're exactly right. And there is this neat picture of being born and then growing. And if you had a child and the child wasn't growing, if I had friends who had a 3-year-old and the kid never got bigger, I would recommend that they take their child to the doctor because something would be wrong. Yes. That's it.
Don't you think too, though, that this is, we think of these as behavioral often, but they are also mental. And the growth has to occur in our own minds and in our own hearts. Just because we shut them off behaviorally, just because we don't go out and slander someone, if we are slandering them in our own thoughts, we are still slandering them.
Yes.
If we are envying them in our own thoughts, it's still envy. So, it's not just the behavior, it's also our internal, ethos around all of it.
Yeah, and I think that's why the hypocrisy is so important. Because if I'm not saying the bad things, but I'm still thinking them, then I'm play acting. Right? And sometimes you can't really help how you react to something. But what do you do with that thought after you react? Do you dwell on that bad thing? What do you do?
Well, just if you kind of look at where we come from in verse 1, and I look at the end of verse 2 and 3, and it just looks like it's where he's finishing here, or where he's getting to is a maturity, is these things, and it's kind of a contrast, as newborn, you're longing for the milk if you have tasted the kindness of the Lord. So the conclusion that you come to is this maturity, and that maturity is you're putting off all this other stuff because you realize what the Lord has done for you.
Yeah. We'll pick up here next time. And that is a great way to sort of summarize the idea of putting away, which is divorce language. You are totally removing those things from yourself, not just how you act, but your connection to those things at all. Right? So we're a complete change in behavior, in thought, in who we are as a whole person. We'll pick up with that idea next time. Thank you very much. And we did spend a little bit more time here because it's sort of the first chapter and a half are very foundational to what's coming.